Have you ever watched an entire room laugh at the wrong man? The laughter started with one voice and spread across the courtroom like a ripple across still water. It was not loud at first. Just a few amused chuckles. A few raised eyebrows. A few knowing smiles. But for Marcus Reed, none of it seemed to matter. The tall black man stepped through the courthouse doors with a calm expression and a charcoal gray suit that looked neat but unremarkable. He carried no briefcase. No entourage followed him. No one rushed over to greet him. To most people, he looked like just another citizen attending a public hearing. The courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, was already busy. Attorneys moved quickly through the hallways carrying stacks of documents. Reporters checked their phones for updates. Court clerks organized files behind polished wooden counters. The air carried the familiar mixture of quiet conversation, footsteps, and distant echoes from nearby courtrooms. Marcus walked through it all without drawing attention to himself. Yet somehow, attention found him anyway. As he entered courtroom 4, several spectators glanced his way before returning to their conversations. The room was impressive in the way old American courtrooms often are. Tall windows allowed streams of sunlight to spill across polished wood. The state flag stood proudly beside the judge's bench. Rows of benches stretched toward the back of the room where members of the public waited for the proceedings to begin. Marcus selected a seat near the center and quietly sat down. He folded his hands and looked toward the front of the courtroom. His expression never changed. A few minutes later, Officer Derek Vaughn entered through a side door. The white police officer carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. His uniform was immaculate. His badge reflected the morning light. Conversations seemed to quiet slightly as he moved through the room. Derek noticed Marcus almost immediately. Something about the quiet stranger appeared to irritate him. Perhaps it was the confidence. Perhaps it was the calmness. Whatever the reason, Derek continued glancing in his direction. Eventually, he walked over. The room grew slightly quieter. Reporters looked up from their notebooks. A few spectators leaned forward with curiosity. Marcus remained seated. "Can I help you?" Derek asked. Marcus looked up politely. "I am just here to observe." Derek laughed. Not because the answer was funny. Because he had already decided what he thought of the man sitting in front of him. "Observe," he repeated. "You?" Several people nearby smiled. Marcus simply nodded. Derek looked around the courtroom before speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "You know, everybody walks in here thinking they are important." More laughter followed. Marcus said nothing. The officer shook his head and smirked. Then he delivered the sentence that would follow him for the rest of the day. "Trust me," Derek said. "You are nobody." The courtroom laughed again. Marcus did not. He simply looked toward the empty judge's bench and waited. Because while everyone else believed they understood exactly who he was, Marcus already knew something they did not. And 3 hours later, nobody in that courtroom would be laughing anymore. Long before anyone in courtroom 4 laughed at Marcus Reed, his day had begun in a very different way. The sun had barely risen over Richmond when he stepped out of a modest downtown hotel and started walking toward the courthouse. The city was waking up around him. Coffee shops were opening their doors. Office workers hurried down sidewalks carrying travel mugs and briefcases. Traffic moved steadily through the streets as the first rays of sunlight reflected from rows of glass windows. Marcus walked at an unhurried pace, observing everything around him with quiet attention. As he approached a crosswalk near the courthouse, he noticed an elderly woman struggling with a box of documents that had slipped from her arms. Papers scattered across the sidewalk. Several people walked past without stopping. Marcus immediately stepped forward. He knelt beside her, carefully gathered every page, and helped organize the stack before handing it back with a polite smile. The woman thanked him. Marcus simply nodded and continued on his way. A few minutes later, he reached the courthouse entrance. A young court clerk hurried toward the doors carrying several thick case files. One folder slipped from her grasp and landed on the steps. Before she could react, Marcus picked it up and handed it back. Again, he received a grateful thank you. Again, he accepted it with quiet humility. By the time he entered the building, several courthouse employees had already encountered him, and every one of them walked away with the same impression. He was respectful, patient, easy to overlook, yet strangely memorable. Even the security officer stationed at the entrance noticed him. While dozens of visitors rushed through the checkpoint with visible frustration, Marcus greeted the officer warmly and thanked him for his service. The officer smiled. It was a small interaction, the kind most people forget within minutes. Yet somehow it stayed with him. Inside the courthouse, Marcus moved through the hallways without drawing attention to himself. He paused occasionally to study directory signs and courtroom schedules posted on the walls. Nobody would have guessed that he carried himself with such calm because he already knew exactly where he needed to be. When he finally entered courtroom 4 and took his seat, he did so without fanfare. Yet the contrast between Marcus and Officer Derek Vaughn could not have been greater. While Marcus moved quietly through the morning helping strangers and treating everyone with dignity, Derek entered every room expecting recognition. Authority followed him wherever he went, and over time he had become accustomed to it. People listened when he spoke. People moved when he gave instructions. Few ever challenged him. That confidence had slowly hardened into certainty, and certainty had become something even more dangerous. Assumption. By the time Derek noticed Marcus sitting alone in the courtroom, he had already decided exactly who the stranger was. He never asked. He never listened. He simply assumed. And as the courtroom continued filling with attorneys, reporters, and members of the public, Marcus remained seated in silence while Derek continued watching him from across the room. Neither man realized that within a few hours, every assumption made that morning would be put to the test. If someone had asked Officer Derek Vaughn that morning whether he was a good judge of character, he would have answered without hesitation. Absolutely. Years of wearing a badge had convinced him that he could read people within seconds. He believed he could spot dishonesty before a word was spoken. He believed he could recognize importance simply by looking at someone. And as the minutes passed inside courtroom 4, those beliefs only grew stronger. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered the courtroom, and everyone rose to their feet. The conversation stopped. Chairs shifted quietly across the polished floor. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows behind the gallery, casting long shadows across the wooden benches. Once the judge took her seat, the hearing officially began. Attorneys presented arguments. Witnesses were called. Court staff moved efficiently between tables. To most people, it looked like a routine day inside an American courthouse. Yet Derek's attention continued drifting toward Marcus Reed. The stranger remained seated quietly among the spectators. He listened carefully. He took no notes. He spoke to no one. Somehow that bothered Derek more than if Marcus had tried to attract attention. Across the room, reporter Sarah Bennett noticed the same thing. She had spent years covering legal proceedings and had learned to pay attention to unusual details. Marcus seemed unusually calm. Not nervous. Not distracted. Calm. As if nothing happening inside the courtroom surprised him. During a brief recess, Derek finally decided he had seen enough. He walked directly toward Marcus while several spectators watched with growing curiosity. The officer stopped beside the bench and folded his arms. "You seem very interested in what is happening here," he said. Marcus looked up. "I am listening." Derek smirked. "Most people come here because they have a reason." "Maybe I do," Marcus replied. The answer immediately drew Derek's attention. "Then what is it?" Marcus paused for a moment. "I am here to observe." Derek laughed softly. "That is not much of an explanation." Marcus remained composed. "It is the truth." The conversation attracted nearby attention. A few people turned their heads. Sarah quietly reached for her notebook. Something about the exchange felt important. Derek leaned slightly closer. You know, people usually identify themselves when they show up in places like this. Marcus nodded. Sometimes. And sometimes? Derek asked. Sometimes people reveal more about themselves before introductions are necessary. The response caught Derek off guard. It was polite. Respectful. Yet there was something beneath it that made him uncomfortable. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The courtroom noise continued around them, but the tension between them seemed isolated from everything else. Derek eventually shook his head. In his mind, he had already reached a conclusion. Marcus was an outsider trying to appear important. Nothing more. Meanwhile, Marcus simply returned his attention to the proceedings. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not attempt to change Derek's opinion. Because some lessons cannot be taught through explanation. They must be discovered through experience. And although nobody in the courtroom realized it yet, the first cracks were already beginning to form in the assumptions that had shaped the entire morning. The hearing resumed, but the atmosphere inside courtroom 4 had changed. What had begun as a routine morning now carried a quiet sense of anticipation. Judge Eleanor Whitmore listened carefully as attorneys presented arguments, yet even she seemed aware that an entirely different story was unfolding in the gallery. Marcus Reed remained seated exactly where he had been all morning. Calm. Patient. Unmoved. Meanwhile, Officer Derek Vaughn found himself paying less attention to the legal proceedings and more attention to the man sitting among the spectators. The stranger's composure continued to bother him. Most people who attracted scrutiny became defensive. Most people tried to explain themselves. Marcus did neither. During another pause in the proceedings, Derek finally decided to act. He crossed the courtroom floor and stopped directly in front of Marcus. Several spectators immediately noticed. Reporter Sarah Bennett lowered her notebook and watched carefully. A few attorneys glanced over their shoulders. Even the court clerk briefly looked up from her paperwork. Derek folded his arms. Since you seem determined to stay here all day, why do not we clear something up? Marcus looked at him politely. What would you like to clear up? Derek extended his hand. Identification. The request hung in the air. Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. Of course. Without hesitation, he reached inside his suit jacket and removed a leather wallet. There was no argument. No protest. No visible frustration. He simply handed it over. The ease of his cooperation surprised Derek. For a brief moment, the officer appeared uncertain. Then his confidence returned. He opened the wallet and began examining its contents. A driver's license. Several cards. Ordinary items. Nothing remarkable. A faint smile appeared on Derek's face. He looked around the room as if expecting confirmation that his suspicions had been correct all along. That is what I thought, he said loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. A few people exchanged knowing looks. Sarah continued writing. Yet Marcus remained perfectly calm. Derek continued searching through the wallet. Then his attention shifted. Hidden behind another fold was a credential holder. His hand paused. The room seemed to grow quieter. Slowly, he removed it. His eyes narrowed as he examined the identification inside. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared on his face. It lasted only a second before being replaced by a dismissive laugh. Interesting, he said. He held the credential up slightly. Very interesting. Several spectators leaned forward. Marcus said nothing. Derek shook his head. You actually expect people to believe this? The question echoed across the courtroom. Marcus remained seated. Believe what? He asked calmly. Derek stared at the credential again before looking back at him. That this belongs to you. A murmur moved through the gallery. Sarah immediately stopped writing and looked up. Whatever Derek had found, it was no longer an ordinary piece of identification. Marcus folded his hands and met the officer's gaze. If you have doubts, he said quietly, there is a very simple way to resolve them. Derek smirked. And what is that? Marcus glanced toward the judge's bench. Verify it. For the first time that morning, the attention of the entire courtroom shifted away from the hearing itself. Attorneys stopped organizing documents. Spectators leaned forward. Even the quiet conversations near the back of the room faded into silence. Whatever Officer Derek Vaughn had discovered inside Marcus Reed's wallet had suddenly become the most important thing in the building. Derek continued holding the credential between his fingers as if the answer might change if he stared at it long enough. The confidence that had carried him through the morning remained visible, but something else had appeared beside it. Doubt. It was small. Almost invisible. Yet it was there. Marcus noticed it immediately. So did reporter Sarah Bennett. She lowered her notebook and watched every movement. Across the room, Judge Eleanor Whitmore finally looked up from the documents on her bench. Her attention settled on the credential in Derek's hand. Officer Vaughn, she said calmly. The room became even quieter. Derek turned toward the bench. Yes, Your Honor. Bring that here. Her voice carried no emotion. No urgency. Yet everyone understood it was not a request. Derek walked forward and handed the credential to the judge. She examined it carefully. The courtroom waited. Sunlight continued streaming through the tall windows. Dust particles drifted through the golden beams. Somewhere in the hallway outside, distant footsteps echoed against marble floors. Inside courtroom 4, nobody moved. Judge Whitmore studied the identification for several seconds before setting it beside a sealed folder that had been delivered earlier that morning. Marcus noticed the gesture immediately. His expression did not change, but his eyes briefly focused on the folder. Sarah noticed that as well. The small interaction raised a question she could not answer. Why did the judge seem completely unsurprised by what she was seeing? Derek stepped forward. Your Honor, I have serious doubts about the authenticity of that credential. The judge folded her hands. Based on what? Derek hesitated. It does not make sense. A few spectators nodded. Derek continued. He arrived alone. He has not identified himself. He has been sitting here all morning observing court proceedings without explanation. Judge Whitmore listened without interruption. And therefore? Derek gestured toward Marcus. Therefore I do not believe that credential belongs to him. Another silence followed. The judge looked toward Marcus. Mr. Reed, would you care to respond? Every eye in the room turned toward him. Marcus stood slowly. His voice remained calm. No, Your Honor. A ripple of surprise passed through the gallery. Derek frowned. Sarah stopped writing. Even the court clerk looked confused. The judge raised an eyebrow. No. Marcus shook his head respectfully. The truth does not require my opinion. The words settled heavily across the room. Derek appeared frustrated. Marcus simply returned to his seat. Judge Whitmore glanced once more at the credential and then at the sealed folder beside it. Whatever she saw seemed to confirm something already forming in her mind. Finally, she turned toward the court clerk. Please contact the appropriate federal office and verify the identification. A wave of anticipation swept through the courtroom. The clerk immediately reached for the telephone. Derek folded his arms with renewed confidence, convinced the call would validate everything he believed. Marcus remained silent. Patient. Unmoved. Because while everyone else waited for an answer, he already knew exactly what it would be. The waiting was the hardest part. Once the court clerk placed the call, the entire rhythm of the courtroom seemed to slow. Conversations disappeared. Reporters stopped whispering. Even the attorneys who had spent the morning focused on legal arguments now found themselves watching a simple telephone resting on the clerk's desk. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained composed behind the bench, occasionally reviewing the sealed folder beside her. Officer Derek Vaughn stood with his arms crossed, projecting confidence, but the certainty he had displayed earlier no longer appeared effortless. Across the room, Marcus Reed sat quietly, his attention fixed on nothing in particular. He looked neither worried nor excited. To anyone watching closely, it almost seemed as if he had already lived through this moment in his mind long before it arrived. Minutes passed. The clerk continued speaking softly into the receiver, occasionally writing notes on a legal pad. Every time she nodded, spectators leaned forward, hoping to read meaning into a gesture. Sarah Bennett filled pages of her notebook with observations. She had covered courtrooms for years, yet she had never seen an entire room become so invested in the verification of a single credential. Something bigger was happening. She could feel it. Finally, the clerk lowered the phone. The simple movement immediately captured everyone's attention. A silence settled across the courtroom so complete that the faint ticking of a wall clock became noticeable. The clerk stood and walked toward Judge Whitmore. She handed over a handwritten note. The judge read it carefully. Once. Then again. Her expression remained professional, but something changed in her eyes. It was not surprise. It was confirmation. Derek noticed it. Sarah noticed it. Marcus noticed it too. The judge placed the note beside the credential and looked toward the gallery. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The room seemed frozen between two possibilities. Then Judge Whitmore finally broke the silence. The identification has been verified. A wave of shock moved through the courtroom. Several spectators exchanged stunned looks. One attorney lowered his glasses. Sarah immediately began writing again. Derek remained motionless. For a moment, he appeared unable to process what he had just heard. The credential was real. The federal identification belonged to Marcus Reed. The assumption that had guided every decision he made that morning had just collapsed. Yet Judge Whitmore was not finished. She glanced once more at the note before continuing. Federal authorities have also confirmed that Mr. Reed is currently serving in an active federal capacity. The statement landed even harder than the first. A murmur spread through the gallery. Reporters looked at one another. Spectators whispered quietly. Derek's confidence faded visibly. Questions now replaced certainty. Who exactly was Marcus Reed? Why had he been sitting in that courtroom all day? And why did the judge seem less surprised than everyone else? Marcus slowly stood. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply adjusted his jacket and waited. Because while the courtroom believed the mystery had finally been solved, Marcus knew they had only uncovered the first layer of a much larger truth. The reaction inside Courtroom 4 was immediate. The moment Judge Eleanor Whitmore confirmed that Marcus Reed's credentials were authentic and that he was serving in an active federal capacity, the assumptions that had shaped the entire day began to unravel. Reporters exchanged stunned looks. Spectators whispered to one another. Attorneys who had ignored Marcus only an hour earlier now studied him with renewed interest. Yet Marcus himself remained unchanged. He stood quietly beside his seat with the same calm expression he had carried since walking through the courthouse doors that morning. Across the room, Officer Derek Vaughn struggled to hide his uncertainty. The confidence that had once seemed unshakable now felt increasingly fragile. He had spent hours treating Marcus as if he were an inconvenience. Now he was being forced to reconsider everything. Judge Whitmore opened the sealed folder resting beside her. The movement immediately captured the attention of everyone present. Sarah Bennett noticed it first. The reporter leaned forward, sensing that another revelation was coming. The judge reviewed several pages before looking directly at Marcus. "Mr. Reed," she said, "federal authorities have also confirmed that your presence here today is authorized." A murmur spread through the gallery. Authorized. The word carried weight. It suggested purpose. It suggested planning. Most importantly, it suggested that Marcus had not arrived by accident. Derek immediately spoke. Authorized for what? The question echoed through the room. Judge Whitmore considered her response carefully. I am permitted to disclose only limited information. She glanced down at the documents once more. However, federal authorities have confirmed that Mr. Reed is participating in an ongoing interagency review process involving professional conduct, procedural compliance, and administrative oversight. The room fell silent. Sarah stopped writing for a moment. Every person present seemed to be processing the statement at the same time. This was no longer simply about a credential. It was about why Marcus had been there all along. Derek stared at the judge. You are saying he was sent here? Judge Whitmore folded her hands. I am saying his presence was neither random nor unauthorized. The answer landed harder than any accusation could have. Marcus remained silent. He offered no explanation. No defense. No celebration. He simply allowed the facts to speak for themselves. Sarah looked from Marcus to Derek and back again. Suddenly every interaction from earlier that morning seemed different. The calmness. The patience. The refusal to argue. Marcus had never acted like a man trying to prove something. He had acted like a man who already knew the truth would arrive eventually. Derek slowly turned toward him. For the first time all day, there was no arrogance in his expression. Only questions. Why did you not say any of this before? Marcus met his gaze. Would it have changed how you treated me? The question hung in the air. Derek opened his mouth but found no immediate answer. Around them, the courtroom remained perfectly still. Because everyone knew the question was no longer directed at one officer. It was directed at every person who had laughed, doubted, judged, or dismissed a stranger before learning who he really was. And although the truth had finally begun to emerge, Marcus Reed knew the most important revelation was still waiting just beyond the horizon. The silence that followed Marcus Reed's question felt heavier than anything that had happened all day. Would it have changed how you treated me? Nobody answered because nobody needed to. The truth was already visible on every face in the courtroom. Judge Eleanor Whitmore allowed the moment to settle before opening the sealed folder once more. This time, she removed several additional documents and reviewed them carefully. The room watched in complete silence. Reporter Sarah Bennett could sense another shift approaching. She had spent years covering stories involving public officials, but she had rarely seen a room move so quickly from certainty to self-reflection. Across the courtroom, Officer Derek Vaughn stood motionless. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. In its place was a growing realization that he had spent the entire day judging a man he never truly knew. Judge Whitmore finally looked up. There is one additional matter I am authorized to acknowledge, she said. Every person in the courtroom leaned forward. Marcus remained calm. He already knew what was coming. Federal authorities have confirmed that Mr. Reed's assignment includes observational responsibilities connected to an ongoing review process. The statement immediately drew attention. Sarah lowered her pen for a moment. Several attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. Even some members of the public appeared confused. The judge continued carefully. The purpose of such reviews is to evaluate conduct, procedures, and professional interactions within public institutions. Nobody spoke. Yet everyone understood the significance. This was no longer simply about credentials. It was about behavior. About decisions. About how people treated one another when they believed nobody important was watching. The realization spread through the room one person at a time. Marcus had not entered the courthouse seeking attention. He had entered as an observer. And throughout the day, people had revealed themselves through their own choices. Sarah suddenly understood why Marcus had remained so calm. He never needed to win an argument. He never needed to prove his worth. Every interaction had already become part of a larger picture. Derek slowly looked around the courtroom. The spectators who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact. The attorneys who had dismissed Marcus seemed thoughtful. Even the court staff appeared to be reconsidering the events of the morning. Judge Whitmore closed the folder. Let me be clear, she said. No conclusions are being announced today, and no findings are being presented in this courtroom. The statement restored a sense of balance. This was not about punishment. It was about accountability. It was about understanding how assumptions shape behavior. Marcus finally spoke. His voice remained calm and measured. Most people act differently when they think someone important is watching. He paused briefly. Character is revealed when they think nobody important is watching. The words settled across the room. Sarah immediately wrote them down. She knew they would become the heart of her story. Derek lowered his eyes. For the first time all day, he seemed less concerned about who Marcus Reed was and more concerned about the version of himself he had shown to everyone else. And as the afternoon sunlight continued streaming through the tall courtroom windows, one final lesson became impossible to ignore. The biggest reveal of the day was not that Marcus carried federal credentials. It was that the people around him had revealed their own character long before they ever learned his identity. The afternoon sun hung low outside the courthouse windows as the proceedings finally began drawing to a close. The tension that had filled courtroom 4 for most of the day had transformed into something quieter. Reflection. People who had arrived expecting an ordinary hearing now sat in thoughtful silence, replaying every moment they had witnessed. Judge Eleanor Whitmore organized the final documents on her bench. Reporters reviewed their notes. Attorneys quietly gathered their files. Yet very few people seemed eager to leave. It felt as though the courtroom itself was holding on to the lesson that had unfolded within its walls. Marcus Reed stood near the center aisle, preparing to leave just as quietly as he had arrived. He had never demanded attention. He had never raised his voice. He had never attempted to impress anyone with titles or credentials. The truth had spoken on its own. Across the room, Officer Derek Vaughn remained where he stood. The confidence that had defined him earlier that morning was gone. In its place was a deeper awareness of how quickly assumptions could shape behavior. For several moments, he simply watched Marcus. Then, before the room could fully disperse, Derek stepped forward. The movement immediately caught the attention of several spectators. Sarah Bennett lowered her notebook one final time. Nobody spoke. Derek stopped a few feet from Marcus and looked directly at him. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any speech. Marcus listened quietly. Derek took a slow breath. "I decided who you were before I knew anything about you." The courtroom remained silent. "I thought I understood everything the moment I saw you." Marcus nodded slightly. "A lot of people do." Derek lowered his eyes briefly before looking back up. "Why did you stay calm through all of it?" Marcus considered the question. "Because anger would not have changed the truth." The answer settled over the room. Judge Whitmore watched from the bench with a thoughtful expression. Sarah quickly wrote down every word. Derek gave a small nod. He seemed to understand. Not completely. Perhaps nobody ever does in a single day. But enough to recognize the mistake. As people slowly began leaving, Marcus collected his wallet and adjusted his jacket. The courthouse that had echoed with laughter only hours earlier now felt entirely different. Respect had replaced assumption. Reflection had replaced certainty. Before reaching the exit, Marcus paused briefly and looked back toward the courtroom. His gaze moved across the spectators, the reporters, the attorneys, and finally toward Derek. "The badge was never the important part," he said. "It only revealed what people chose to show before they knew who I was." Nobody responded. Nobody needed to. The lesson was already complete. Marcus turned and walked toward the doors. Warm sunlight spilled across the floor as he disappeared into the hallway beyond. The room remained quiet long after he was gone. And in that silence, everyone was left with the same realization. Titles may reveal authority. Positions may reveal status. But character reveals itself long before either one is known. Because the true measure of a person is not how they treat someone important. It is how they treat someone they believe is nobody at all.